In 1975, Cambodia was a country of temples, rivers, and families. Mothers raised children. Young women went to school. Life was not perfect, but it was life. Then on April 17, 1975, the Khmer Rouge marched into Phnom Penh. Within hours, everything changed. Cities were emptied. Families were separated at gunpoint, and a regime that called itself a revolution began one of the most brutal social experiments in human history. But for the women of Cambodia, what followed was not just war. It was something far more personal, far more calculated, and in many ways, far more cruel. Nearly 2 million people died in 4 years. But death was not the only thing women had to fear. What was done to them was methodical, intentional, and deeply hidden from the world. And decades later, survivors are still carrying wounds that never fully healed. Some of those responsible are still alive today. This is the story the history books leave out. Cambodia, in early 1975, was a country already scarred by civil war. But for most women, daily life still revolved around tradition. Villages were built around rice paddies. Women worked in markets, raised children, attended Buddhist ceremonies. In cities like Phnom Penh, young women studied at universities, worked in shops, dreamed of becoming teachers or nurses. Families stayed together. Marriages were arranged by parents, celebrated with music and community. Women had roles, responsibilities, and a future they could imagine. Then came April 17th. The Khmer Rouge, led by Pol Pot, entered Phnom Penh. Soldiers in black uniforms and red scarves. Most were teenagers. They carried AK-47s and megaphones. They announced liberation, victory over American imperialism, the end of corruption. People cheered in the streets. They thought the war was over. Within 3 days, the entire city was empty. Over 2 million people were forced to walk into the countryside. Hospitals were evacuated. Patients still hooked to IVs were told to march or die. Families were separated immediately. Men sent to one labor camp, women to another, children taken to communes. The Khmer Rouge called it Year Zero. Everything before this moment was erased. Money was banned, schools were closed, religion was forbidden, and the traditional family structure, the foundation of Cambodian society, was dismantled overnight. For women, this was just the beginning. The Khmer Rouge divided the population into categories. New people, those from the cities, were considered enemies. Old people, rural peasants, were trusted. But both groups were put to work. Women were sent to labor camps, where they dug irrigation canals, built dams, and farmed rice paddies under armed guard. They worked from sunrise to long after dark. There were no days off, no rest, no medical care. Women were given 1 can of watery rice porridge per day, sometimes less. Starvation was policy. The weak were considered useless. Those who collapsed were accused of being lazy, accused of sabotage, and accusations meant execution. Women watched their friends dragged into the jungle and never seen again. The Khmer Rouge did not waste bullets. They used hose, bamboo sticks, and bare hands. But the camps were not just about labor. They were about control. Women were forced to cut their hair short, told to wear identical black pajamas. Jewelry was confiscated. Makeup was banned. Any sign of femininity was considered bourgeois, dangerous, a threat to the revolution. The goal was not just to use women's bodies for work. It was to strip them of identity, to turn them into nameless, faceless units of production. One survivor later said, "They did not see us as women. They saw us as machines. And when a machine breaks, you throw it away." But the labor camps were not the worst of what was coming. In 1977, the Khmer Rouge introduced a new policy: mass forced marriages. These were not unions based on love or choice. They were arranged by local cadres, low-ranking Khmer Rouge officials, who decided who would marry whom. Sometimes the bride and groom met for the first time on their wedding day. Sometimes they were told just hours before the ceremony. Refusal was not an option. Women who resisted were accused of being enemies of Angkar, the organization. That accusation was a death sentence, so they obeyed. Ceremonies were held in groups, sometimes 10 couples, sometimes 50. There was no music, no celebration, just a brief speech about serving the revolution. Then the couples were sent to consummate the marriage under surveillance. This is where the horror deepened. Khmer Rouge soldiers monitored newlyweds to ensure the marriage was consummated. In some cases, they listened outside the sleeping quarters. In other cases, they watched. Women were given no privacy, no dignity, no choice. If a woman showed reluctance or fear, she was accused of being counter-revolutionary. Some were beaten. Some were raped by soldiers as punishment before being sent back to their assigned husbands. The purpose of these marriages was not romantic. It was about control and reproduction. The Khmer Rouge wanted to increase the population to build their agrarian utopia. Women's bodies were tools for that goal. Pregnancy was expected. Contraception was forbidden. Women who failed to conceive were shamed. Those who became pregnant were given no prenatal care. Many gave birth in the fields, alone, with no medical help. Infant mortality was staggering. One survivor recalled being forced to marry a man she had never spoken to. She was 15 years old. He was 40. She said, "I was not a wife. I was property." And if forced marriage was not enough, there was something even darker happening in the shadows. For decades, this part of the story was buried. Survivors did not speak about it. Researchers did not ask. But in recent years, testimony has emerged. What happened to women under the Khmer Rouge was not just forced marriage. It was widespread sexual violence, rape, and abuse carried out by soldiers, guards, and camp leaders. Women in labor camps were vulnerable. They had no protection, no one to report to. Khmer Rouge soldiers held absolute power. They could take what they wanted, and many did. Women were raped in the fields, in makeshift barracks, in interrogation rooms. Some were taken as sex slaves by local commanders, kept in hidden quarters and abused repeatedly. If they became pregnant, they were either killed or forced to continue working until they miscarried. The most disturbing part is that this violence was not always framed as violence. In some cases, it was presented as revolutionary duty. Women were told that submitting to a soldier or cadre was service to Angkar. Refusal was betrayal. So many women complied out of fear, only to carry shame and trauma for the rest of their lives. Even in the infamous S-21 prison, also known as Tuol Sleng, where over 12,000 people were tortured and executed, records show that women were subjected to sexual abuse before being killed. Interrogators used rape as a tool of humiliation and terror. Female prisoners were stripped, photographed, and violated before being sent to the killing fields. And yet, for decades, this was not recognized as part of the genocide. It was not included in history books, not discussed in tribunals. Survivors carried the weight in silence. Many still do. But the abuse did not end with the fall of the regime in 1979. The scars ran deeper than anyone realized. On January 7, 1979, Vietnamese forces invaded Cambodia and overthrew the Khmer Rouge. The regime collapsed. The camps were opened. Survivors stumbled out, skeletal, traumatized, searching for family members who were often already dead. The killing stopped, but the suffering did not. For women, liberation brought a new kind of pain. Many returned to villages that no longer existed. Families were gone. Husbands, children, parents, all lost. Women who had been forced into marriages were now widows, or worse, still bound to men they never chose, living with the trauma of what had been done to them in the name of revolution. There was no mental health care, no counseling, no recognition of what they had endured. Cambodian culture, deeply rooted in shame and silence around sexual violence, made it nearly impossible for women to speak. Many never told their own children what happened. They carried it alone. Economically, women faced devastation. The Khmer Rouge had destroyed the economy. There were no jobs, no schools, no infrastructure. Women became the backbone of survival. They raised orphaned children, rebuilt homes, worked in fields to grow food, and they did it with bodies broken by years of forced labor and trauma. The psychological toll was immense. Depression, anxiety, PTSD. Many survivors described nightmares that never stopped, flashbacks triggered by sounds, smells, or the sight of black clothing. Some women took their own lives. Others survived but felt hollow. One woman said, "I lived, but part of me died in those years. I never got it back." And while the world began to learn about the Khmer Rouge genocide, the specific experiences of women remained invisible. The focus was on numbers, death tolls, mass graves, not on forced marriages, not on rape, not on the systematic destruction of women's autonomy and dignity. But in recent years, that silence has started to crack. 6. The fight for justice, tribunals and recognition. It took over 2 decades for the world to act. In 2006, the Extraordinary Chambers in the Courts of Cambodia, also known as the Khmer Rouge Tribunal, was established. Its mission was to prosecute senior leaders and those most responsible for crimes committed between 1975 and 1979. The trials began in 2009. For the first time, survivors had a platform to speak, and women began to come forward. They testified about forced marriages, about rape, about being treated as objects by a regime that claimed to liberate them. Their stories were devastating, and they were heard. In 2018, the tribunal made history. It convicted 2 surviving Khmer Rouge leaders, Nuon Chea and Kyo Samphan, not just for crimes against humanity, but specifically for forced marriage and rape. It was the first time an international court recognized forced marriage as a crime against humanity. The first time the sexual violence endured by Cambodian women was formally acknowledged in a legal setting. Survivors wept in the courtroom. Some said they finally felt seen. One woman said, "For 40 years, I thought no one cared. Now I know the world was listening." But justice was incomplete. Most of the Khmer Rouge leadership was dead. Pol Pot died in 1998, never facing trial. Many mid-level commanders lived freely in Cambodian society, never held accountable, and the tribunal only prosecuted a handful of cases. Thousands of perpetrators were never touched. Still, the tribunal gave survivors something powerful: validation, a public record, proof that what happened to them was real, was wrong, and was not their fault. And yet, even now, the story is not over. In 2022, new evidence emerged. Researchers uncovered previously unseen documents and photographs from Khmer Rouge archives. Among them were lists of women transferred between camps, records of forced marriages, and internal memos discussing the regulation of women's bodies. The documents confirmed what survivors had been saying all along. The abuse was not random, it was policy. That same year, a group of survivors launched a campaign demanding reparations. Not just symbolic recognition, but financial compensation for what was stolen from them: their youth, their health, their families. The Cambodian government has been slow to respond. Many survivors are now in their 60s and 70s. Time is running out. In 2023, a documentary featuring real survivor testimonies and rare archival footage was released. It became one of the most watched films on the Khmer Rouge genocide. For the first time, younger generations of Cambodians, many of whom were never taught this history in school, began to ask questions. What happened to our mothers, our grandmothers? Why were we never told? Schools in Cambodia, are beginning to include more detailed accounts of the genocide in their curriculums. Museums are adding exhibits focused on women's experiences, and survivor groups are organizing, refusing to let the world forget. But there is still resistance. Some in Cambodian society believe it is better to move on, to stop reopening old wounds. Women who speak publicly are sometimes shamed or told they are dishonoring the dead by discussing sexual violence. The stigma remains. And in the broader world, the story of what happened to Cambodian women is still not widely known. Most people have heard of the Khmer Rouge. Few know the specific and gendered violence that women endured. That is beginning to change. But slowly. Her name was Bofana. She was a young woman in Phnom Penh before the Khmer Rouge took over. She had a boyfriend. They wrote love letters. When the Khmer Rouge found those letters, they arrested her. At S21 prison, she was tortured for months. They wanted her to confess to being a spy. She refused. She was executed in 1977. Her story became a symbol, a reminder that love, memory, and individuality were crimes under the Khmer Rouge. Then there was Sochiata. She survived forced marriage at age 14. Her husband beat her. The Khmer Rouge told her it was her duty to endure it. After 1979, she tried to rebuild her life. But she carried the trauma in silence for decades. It was only in 2017, during the tribunal hearings, that she testified publicly. She said, "I wanted my children to know what happened. I wanted the world to know we were not just victims. We were human beings." Another survivor, Neri, spent 3 years in a labor camp. She was raped by a camp guard. She became pregnant. When the Khmer Rouge fell, she gave birth to a daughter. She raised that child alone, never telling her the truth of how she was conceived. When her daughter turned 30, Neri finally spoke. She said, "I did not want her to carry my shame, but I realized the shame was never mine. It belonged to them." These voices are powerful, but they are also fragile. Many survivors have passed away. Those who remain are aging. Their testimonies are among the last first-hand accounts the world will ever hear. Organizations are racing to record as many as possible, to preserve the truth before it is lost. And the truth is this: what the Khmer Rouge did to women was not a side effect of war. It was a central part of their strategy. To control the population, you control women. To erase a culture, you erase the family. And to break a people, you break their dignity at the most intimate level. The survivors who speak today are not just sharing their pain. They are ensuring that this chapter is never erased again. History books will tell you that the Khmer Rouge regime ended in 1979. That is not entirely true. For the women who survived, the regime never fully ended. It lives in nightmares, in scars, in the silence that still surrounds what was done to them. Cambodia today is a country of temples and rivers once again. Families gather. Children go to school. But underneath that surface is a grief that has never been fully acknowledged. A generation of women who gave everything and received almost nothing in return. Not justice, not compensation, not even, in many cases, the chance to speak. Some of those responsible are still alive, living quietly, unrepentant. The world has moved on, but the women have not. They cannot. And perhaps the most tragic part is this: what happened in Cambodia was not unique. Forced marriage, sexual violence, the use of women's bodies as weapons of war, these patterns repeat. In Rwanda, in Bosnia, in Syria, in Myanmar. The tactics change, the faces change, but the strategy remains the same. If we do not listen to the survivors of the Khmer Rouge, we are doomed to let it happen again, and again, and again. The women of Cambodia are still here, still fighting, still carrying a history the world tried to forget. They deserve more than silence. They deserve more than sympathy. They deserve to be remembered.